My one piece of feedback would be great setup, great intro, nice way to kind of frame what you're doing, drive harder on getting to a topic. Drive harder on getting to an issue that you can start with. And the issue, you may find very quickly the issue changes and you want to get back to the person. And I'd probably even leave reserving the right to say once we've had a conversation we'd love to check in. But driving to a topic or an issue is going to be critical. And I love the idea that if you can't get them there, then back up and say, let us help you figure out what might be the most relevant topics to spend some time on. Okay? Any other observations?
One other thing in terms of the flexibility around this, David's been pushing the idea of trying to do it as much as possible all at once and take 8 hours. And the reason is what you lose from one session to another. It's just a trade-off. I don't think it's true to do it in 8 hours. If you're going to break it up into 2-hour sections across 2 weeks, you're in trouble. How are you going to deal with getting people to remember from one session to the next and keep them moving? You're just going to have to invest a lot in making that happen. It isn't that you can't do that, and sometimes that's the best you can do.
Absolutely.
You've got to organize around it.
And in fact, what it will do is it will put more of an onus on you to be tracking and managing and capturing, because you're going to have to, if you do 2-hour sessions, you've got to plan on the first 15 or 20 minutes at a minimum of each one of those is getting them reconnected, right? And so you're going to have to, and that's going to be on you, that's not going to be on them. If they're paying a whole bunch of money to come in, some of them may actually do some of that, but in this case they're not going to do that. Okay? So being aware of that's pretty key. And I would agree completely, if you can get an 8-hour window, that's going to be the best way to do it. If you don't, though, I just repeat myself, spending some time doing some one-on-one follow-ups with some key people is a worthwhile thing to do. And I'd even suggest if you get a couple hours, pay a lot of attention to who's saying what, and you'll get a sense pretty quick for people who have pretty good content and have some pretty good reasons for saying what they're saying. And you may just catch them at the end of a meeting and say, love to do a follow-up phone call. But we set up a time to chat for a few minutes and you can do some more digging. So use that any way you can. That's valuable. The issue you've got to be real careful of when you do the one-on-ones is that you don't end up just playing out one individual's agenda, because there's going to be, you're going to have different agendas in the group. Okay? The issue with time is going to be a huge issue when you're dealing with small companies. That's just the nature of that beast. That's going to be tough because it's people are stretched. Okay. If you do get lucky and get in one, and I was kidding about the cabinet place in Goshen, the cool thing, if you get in one that really is a manufacturing process or a building process, you can even, if they'll let you, come in and observe for a little while. And actually seeing some of the work go on, you can start to fill in some of the culture blocks yourself just by what you observe. And in a lot of work situations, that's not going to be possible. There's probably nothing proprietary about the way people are building cabinets, but you're going to learn a whole bunch from watching that process.
I thought you did a good job, kind of just with what you were saying before, not scaring them with like terminology and OB, but just saying, simple solutions can really save a lot of. I can't remember the words you guys used, but just focusing on the fact that we can do a lot with really simple stuff, and it doesn't have to be like we're going to completely reorganize everything that you do here, but it's going to be simple.
Yeah, and I think the tension that you play with that issue, right, is if it's too simple, they're going to say, well, we've already tried that.
Yeah.
Right? And if it's too complex, you're going to scare them off. And so I think it's a great point, and all I can tell you is have your feelers out when you're talking. Be listening for and watching reactions and seeing what's working and what's not working, and pursue that. Because the truth is, with this framing, you can make it very, very simple. You can also get into huge, complex projects with this kind of stuff. And having a sense of what they're looking for, again, is driving for that topic. The clearer you can get around topic, the better you can start kind of connecting the dots for them around that. Thing, just not about the content of the case, but about the model itself. Any model questions? Yes, sir.
I guess the comment that I would make is it's harder and it's easier to do it in the abstract a little bit. I think the value of facilitating is really they have to tell you what their issues are. And so we didn't do the note cards, which I think is brilliant, and we didn't do the like, okay, silently group them thing. There's some fun activities where you really facilitate them telling you.
Yeah.
And I think that's a little more organic.
Yeah.
But it takes a lot more time and effort, and so
Yeah.
it's a mixed bag.
In fact, I'd say I think the hook you've got to watch out for is getting into solving. I mean, you've gone through school, and most of you've been through a year and a half of an MBA program, and you've probably become geniuses at solving cases. And the watch out I think you've got when you're in doing this is you don't want to jump in and solve the case. You've got to pull as much out as you can, and there's going to be a point in time where your insights and your wisdom are really going to be critical. But don't take the hook too soon, because it's actually a really good way to get booted out. Because if you jump to conclusions too quick, you can actually put yourself in a bad spot, especially using this kind of an approach. And it is much harder when you're doing it from a case, but that's what you got to kind of train yourself in.
So how, before we started, we hold ourselves accountable to make sure the right points fit in the right box. It seems like a lot of those overlap. Why and how, I guess, how important is it, and why is it important to make sure you're in the right box with this?
Great question. What's most important, first and foremost for me, is that you get the data. The reason for me why it's important you go box through box in it is that there's probably a lot of stuff they're not going to naturally even talk about unless you push on it. And so many people will have a very simple solution to this, and simple may not be fair, even if it's a complex solution. And getting them to look and think about it from a system standpoint, they're going to learn stuff in the process itself as well. So for me, the reason for getting them to go through box by box is there's data that you need to collect in each one of those areas, and it prevents you from jumping to conclusions too quickly. If they say something that's really valuable and it fits in another box, capture it and even acknowledge that's what you're doing. So you don't have to shut down the conversation, but you want to make sure you're thorough going through the process. Because a lot of times the solutions to this framework are going to come from places they're not even thinking about. Does that make sense? Did you want to comment on that? Okay. Other questions or comments? I think you had one that...
I don't even remember exactly what it was, but it was right from the get-go. It was going right along with that. Is we had a difficult time. We'd get into a conversation, and then we'd be like, well, this actually fits with the processes than it does with leadership or with our culture. So
yeah.
Yeah.
And it's not about being rigid around it at all. It's just being thorough and making sure you're capturing things. Okay, please.
Do you typically film these kind of things or have an audio recording to make sure you're catching? Because it's not very effective to be, writing while talking to people and trying to fit it in boxes while you're doing that. Do you have some?
Charlie has to pay me a huge per diem to actually even film me in here, so I don't like to be filmed. So no, I don't. Most of the time, with clients, they're not going to want you to film or video stuff. And the people in the room talking, if they think you're doing that, are probably going to get really careful. So part of what's really useful in this process, if you've got multiple people in there, at least having 2 or 3 of you from the team. And so one of you can be asking questions and a couple of people really taking notes and following up and helping each other. It is hard to do it all alone, but most places they'll get pretty skittish if you're filming or videoing. So it's why I don't do well at all when Charlie's here doing this.
This is tied more, I guess, to the whole process, but when we sat in front and talked to you about your company, each team we only sent 2 people out.
Okay.
When we come and do this, we're obviously going to be as a team together. Should we be sending the whole team to go gather data and talk about it, or is it? Have you experienced both? Is one easier than the other? It seems overwhelming to have 6 people there, but it might be better so we all get the same information.
It's a good question. I don't know. I almost want to defer to Alan here from a class standpoint. My sense is if you take everybody, you've just got to be clear about roles. What you don't want is all 6 of you trying to facilitate the same thing, and be clear about that. And I think just be clear with them that we're here as a group and we're taking notes. And it doesn't mean that everybody can't ask a follow-up question. I think part of it also is going to depend on the size of the group that you get. If there's 2 of them and 6 of you, it's gonna seem pretty weird. So I don't have an easy kind of catch-all answer, Alan, I don't
No,
know.
you're looking at the variety really well. We had
Yeah,
one project last year where there were, I think there were 3 people that were in the process from the company, and there were 6 group members, and it was, I mean, they worked it, they talked about it, but it was kind of overwhelming. It was not, and they hadn't worked out a good, motivating kind of performance problem, and that was part of the issue. They just didn't get enough people there. So in terms of the team itself, I think you want to work, by the way, I've been in Japanese companies where that's what you do is you have a whole bunch of people on the wall, along the wall, that don't say anything, and they're there just to get the context.
So you can have some people sitting in the back and others.
And so you can imagine doing that so that the role is really clear, and if you negotiate that up front, I think that can be just fine. My sense is that you probably don't want to have 6 people go for the initial presentation, and most of our groups would send 2 or 3 at the most, and they usually had somebody who knew the person and would take somebody else with them. That is a probably more natural thing. But then the advantage of having 4 or 6 and being able to do some pre-interviews could be pretty good, but you don't want to have all 6 people there in the interviews either. I think it's going to have to be you working, how do you share with each other information that comes out of that?
great, yeah, great. And the other thing is, for me, if you, in fact, Dave and I have done this a couple times, where we'll run 2 different groups at the same time on the same issue and compare. And again, that's a dilemma resource-wise for a lot of companies, but if you had 2 people each with 2 3-person groups, you can collect a lot of information. Yeah, I mean, so however you can divide and conquer. Yes?
So one group looks at all the positives and the other group looks at the negatives. Okay, you're not looking at all the same data, you're looking at positives and negatives. Does that make sense? Positive results, negative results. And then you go through all your boxes.
Yeah. Good questions. Other questions about the model?
So do you find it beneficial to phrase the same question in 2 different ways to understand the problem and the consistency of information that you're getting?
Sure.
Do you do it often, or do you just?
For me, it depends after you've listened and you kind of hone in on a few things, that you come back. And I even sometimes will acknowledge it and say, I want to come back to something we've already talked about, but I want to understand more because this is kind of a theme, or for whatever reason you want to do it. And I think that sometimes, even if you've got a group of 3 or 4 people and a couple of them are commenting a lot on it, making sure you stop and say, well, you know, what do others think? And see if you can pull them out. So I wouldn't hesitate at all to circle the wagon on those kind of things. I think the key is, again, you've got to probably have done enough that you have pulled enough data together that you know which ones you want to circle back on, if that makes sense. If you end up repeating every question every time, you're going to lose folks. But if you find some things you want to hone in and ask a couple different ways and even spin different ways to see what you get, I think that's great. And most people will be very comfortable with that. And if they get impatient, you'll know it. And then just acknowledge, say, you know, we heard X, Y, Z that made us want to come back and test that again. Other questions on the model? So we'll jump into the reports, but let me just say this. What's most important in my mind from what we just did isn't the results we put on the paper right now. What's most important what we just did was you getting comfortable with the framework and you getting some practice facilitating. This isn't, for me, this is not an accuracy exercise. This is for you to get ready for what's coming. So we're not going to get into the rights or wrong of this. We'll have some good discussion and debate probably. But so what team wants to go first? We'll go with the blue line team.
Okay.
I'm just going to have to make up names for you now. So the blue line team. Okay? So
Strategy and was it process?
okay? So talk to us for just a few minutes on each of those, what you were looking at.
So with systems, one of the things that we felt would be a good you want a recommendation? Because we're not diagnosing quite yet, are we?
Don't want a solution. I want,
Okay.
what made you identify that as a, so what was the key presenting issue?
We felt that some of the wrong behaviors were being rewarded.
Okay?
And that some of the right behaviors were not being rewarded by the other side of that.
Okay.
The way that they reward hitting a deadline regardless of anything that happens afterward made the deadline very large in all the conversation, all the focus of activity.
Okay. Yeah, the great news was they made a deadline, the bad news was they made a deadline, right? Okay?
Pretty much.
Okay. All right.
And then there's just some pieces as, you know, the idea that dissension is kind of not valued. We feel there are ways to make that part of the system
Okay.
moving forward. Strategy right now really takes into, the deadline's a big piece of it as well, this idea that we have one product instead of a pipeline. And so when it comes time to bring something out this year, well, yeah, the choice is already made for you, what you're gonna do with
Right,
it.
right.
And so we feel like there's definitely some work with the strategy and how they go about executing it. And then process, again, I hope I'm giving you what you want, but the research and development piece of it is not very robust. It doesn't give them the data they need, it doesn't help them identify where they have issues, which ties into some of our underlying values and beliefs of, you know, when you don't know the information, you pretend you're certain.
Well, because their research process doesn't help deal with their kind of belief that uncertainty is bad. So there's definitely a very kind of an underlying belief that seemed to be presenting itself through, again, the way they talked about avoiding asking further questions that suggested ambiguity and uncertainty was bad. And so they had no structure behind the research process to help handle that.
Okay, good. Good. And good diagnosis, and again, not solutions, but just nice framing of the issues, so very well done. So the team that was next door and then was all sleeping on the couch when I went down there? I'm just kidding, they weren't good now. So go ahead.
So our three were strategy, systems, and leadership capabilities.
Okay.
Strategy and systems were both pretty similar to what they just said. But the big thing with strategy is that it seemed like they kind of weren't even sure what it was, because it was the beginning, it was, do we cannibalize, do we not cannibalize? We just felt like it hadn't really been formulated, and we honestly don't even know who was formulating, like, we're not really sure where the direction comes from. And then flowing down through that is the leadership capabilities, and to us, that's a lot about the communication of the strategy. It's very, just do this and deal with it. And then, I guess we talked about if they have the right skills or not, and we felt like that people did have the right skills, they just weren't able to utilize them because their feedback wasn't heard. If they had thoughts on our process, it didn't matter, we got the orders from the top and you can't say anything to disagree with that. And same thing with systems, is that decisions are made at the top, negative feedback is ignored, and they're rewarded on activity. A lot of people said, we just need to get this through, and if it fails, so what? We did our work.
Okay. So again, that theme coming up of there's no mechanism in there for any kind of feedback in the system. Okay, good. Okay, next group. Let's start with the group that was here in the back corner, and then we'll finish with the group that was down here.
Okay, we chose leadership capabilities, systems, and strategy.
Okay.
And for a lot of the same reasons, we felt like, especially with the leadership and capabilities, as far as the capabilities that drive the cultural behaviors in the organization, they were really heavy on the product development and so chemistry, and it was big. So they cared about, is this a better product? Well, yes, it is, because of these factors that you can clearly see when you look at the products. But they discounted things like consumer preference, things that were actually going to matter, and getting them 6.5% market share, and they didn't think about those as much. So systems, just like what Sean was saying, I think the big thing for us was that it came from the top, and people didn't really necessarily have to agree with it, but that was just what they did, and they didn't really reward or listen to any negative feedback. Strategy, we just felt like it was pretty unclear. It doesn't seem like everybody knew and understood the 6.5%. It was more just like, okay, 6 months, like that's what we've got to deal with. And as long as we have this data, as long as we have 60-40, and we just keep pushing that, then we're okay. Like we've done our part, and that's good. So not everybody was on board with the strategy. We didn't feel like everybody even knew what the real strategy was, or the real results.
Okay, good. Last team that was down here.
So we looked at strategy, structure, and leadership.
Okay.
We saw a big outage in the structure, and just in the fact that in reading this case, we couldn't sense any type of formal team or any designated leader calling the shots, making the final decisions. There was no formal decision-making process, so everyone kind of had their hand in the pot, but there was no one to actually call the shots and move it forward.
So just a whole accountability issue. Okay, all right. Good.
Yeah, strategy was very similar to what Trapper was just talking about. There was no designated strategy in terms of here are the things that need to happen to move forward, here's what we need to achieve before taking it to market. And so as they went, they're like, this is what we have, it's probably good enough. But there's no pre-decided standard there in strategy. And then with the leadership, it was a lack of communication down the line of that strategy or that vision.
Okay.
That just wasn't clearly communicated down the line.
Okay. All right. So 4 for strategy, 1 process, 1 structure, 3 systems, and 3 leadership capabilities. Okay. Nice mix. Yes.
So no one went with underlying values and beliefs. Now, is that an issue, or because I feel like some of the things we're looking at identifies and would deal with some of them even directly, but
okay. So give an example of that.
So some of our underlying values and beliefs: the activity, not the outcomes are important. Deadlines equal fiscal success. Dissent isn't valuable, and those are things that we would hope to work with in the systems, the reward structure of the systems to deal with those underlying values and beliefs.
Yeah. Other reactions to the question. So the question was, gee, why wouldn't that kind of be more preeminent because of that? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think this goes back to where you put your comments. So an underlying value is that the company values the product development side and not necessarily the marketing, but we put that under the leadership and capabilities because what organizational capabilities drive the cultural behaviors? Well, it's the capabilities that they have in product development and the chemistry side versus the marketing side. So I feel like we could have put that up and it would have been the same. And maybe I'm off there, but that's, I feel like it's just where we put things.
Okay, so you think you would address it other ways anyway, in some ways, in terms of what you could add. Go ahead.
A similar thing. It looks like the other things are the things that, looking ahead, just kind of working ahead of us, is that we can kind of change those things, and that's going to influence the underlying values and beliefs. And so,
did anybody have a hard time doing the underlying values and beliefs and trying to identify what they are? Anybody struggle with that part?
We didn't get to it.
Didn't get to it? So it was easy. And we slammed that one. Yeah.
I think the hard part is not having a chance to verify.
Right.
You know, just have the back and forth conversation.
Yeah.
Really feel like you're getting at it.
Go ahead.
I felt like by that point it seemed like they were clear, and I felt like it started to come out when we did the thing of like grouping the behaviors and we looked at cultures.
Yeah.
I feel like that kind of ties in pretty closely.
Yeah.
Every time you get to underlying values.
The interesting part for me with that section of the framework is it's almost always the most difficult one to have a conversation about. In fact, I'd say you did a wonderful job of summarizing those. My experience with that is you'll have to fill in the gaps on those. You're going to have to listen and actually tease that out, because the fact that they are underlying values and beliefs, it's just interesting how people just won't be, in most cases, people won't do a good job of being able to articulate what those are. And the whole issue of, the schedule being the most important and looking at the activities versus the outcomes and some of those kind of things, which are really nice insights into what's going on in the short case. People that are part of that system, I mean, you can look at the system, people are actually doing exactly what they're getting rewarded for. And as long as my part of my assignment is taken care of, then I'm not really going to worry about the general outcome. There's really no line of sight, right? And that's absolutely a whole bunch of what's going on here. But people aren't going to be able to describe those to you. Yeah.
So I guess I just want to clarify. It's kind of like you're looking for like a unified theory of, like a unifying theory that explains the other factors, right? I mean,
I think sometimes it is that. I mean,
like what Dave
yeah.
said was, what makes all of this logical? What
Yeah.
makes all those other things
Yes,
make
yeah.
sense?
Yeah,
And so, like they were saying, it's sort of at a higher level.
it is. It
so
is.
people have
Yeah.
a harder time like
Yeah.
explaining it with one. Does it have to be just one, or can it
No.
be a couple of things?
No, I think it's usually a couple, and that's why I say it's not necessarily an overall unifying one.
Mhm.
There's different components. Like in this one, the activity versus outcome is really clear when you step back and look at it. That's only one of the issues going on. My 2 cents on your question is, I think you almost always will be dealing with the other aspects of the system to get at the underlying values and beliefs. So it's not that we identify them and we go and fix that, but we have to say, okay, what's wrong in the way the processes are designed? What's getting in the way in terms of how we rewarded things? Do we really have a clear line of sight from a strategy standpoint? I had one conversation with the team in back there at the first, and I mean, I couldn't read the case and even tell you I see any strategy at all. I don't know. I know there was a 6.5 objective, but I don't even, if you said, tell me what the strategy is, I couldn't give you any strategic question or context for what's going on here. So that's part of, I mean, the more you ask questions, you're going to go back and start playing with all those levers once you figure out what those are. But it is a nice way to summarize in 3 or 4 bullets what you see going on. Okay? We did this once with a client, and this is a long project, one that Randy Stott and I did together at AMCO. And about 6 or 8 months into it, we were redesigning a business that, anyway, 6 or 8 months into it, Randy came up with this this idea that we were going to have the leadership team identify their 10 biggest underlying assumptions and then have to tell us what they would do if they found out those assumptions were false. It's like, how would it change the business? So we were working with a company who all the money used to be made in the oil industry by, they called them elephants. It was exploration teams out finding huge reservoirs. And no one ever talked about it, but the belief was the only way to make money in that game was you had to, every few years, find an elephant. You had to find a huge reservoir somewhere. And that's how you made money. And if you did that, you could have all kinds of waste in the system and all kinds of other problems. As long as you were finding an elephant often enough, it basically covered up everything else that was going on. So we pointed that out and said, okay, what if you completely reversed that assumption that you could be a very profitable, effective organization by finding a whole bunch of small reservoirs and making that work? How would that change your business model and the way all these elements work then, right? So it's really powerful if you can get at the heart of what some of these are, because they're unstated and people just take them for granted and assume this is true. Like this organization, they just assumed schedule was all that mattered, right? And if you can start playing back, and you may find out that there's a good reason market-wise why that's true, but if you can start playing some of those back to them, it starts to open up all kinds of opportunities in how people think about the business. So Randy actually did, we had some, he did like a top 10 list and did a David Letterman thing with it. It was actually very clever. And we had like the 10, I can't remember what he called it, but it was like the 10 myths of the business. And they were laughing, we had a lot of fun with it, but they hit so close to home. And it was like, these are really the things that are driving almost everything you're doing, and it's impacting every one of those aspects of the system and how you do it.
Did it help them rethink?
It did. We actually started doing strategy exercises and say, what's a business model you'd use if we picked like 2 or 3 of them, said, what's a business model you would use if this was false? And what's a business model you could use if this one was false? And it put them in a space to think in a way they just hadn't been able to do. So, hard to do. Hard to actually get well, I'll speak personally. It's very hard for me to go into a system and actually get my head around what those are. And people aren't usually helpful, but if you can get your head around that and figure out a way to start working it, it's very powerful. Okay? All right, any questions on the case? Any questions on the model? Again, please.
Where can I get like a whole pad of these that I can take with me?
Everywhere I go.
Without paying for the RBL piece.
Oh, I had an answer to you asked that last question. Darn it. I'll let you answer that. I think Dave's got it. I mean,
Dave has it, yeah, but professionally, he's got a advanced. It's a 5-day advanced
certification.
Well, you're not calling it that.
I'm not.
Advanced training.
Yeah.
And then you get all the software or whatever it is to reproduce all that.
I'm sure for purposes of the class, we'll give you whatever you need to use to get stuff
Yeah.
done.
I think that's what he's intending.
Yeah.
From a class standpoint, you won't run out. We'll make sure you're equipped.
Yeah, to go to those guys, yes, you can have, RBL will cough them up or something, I don't know.
Yeah, we're just
Not
great.
that I won't hire you guys when
We're just great guys, we'll cough those up, yeah.
Would you let the participants hold on to these and work through it with you, or would you kind of keep that hidden from them, so they're not jumping ahead?
Oh, Dave gives everybody one,
Everyone gets one, okay.
doesn't he? Yeah.
Did you take them back?
No, because that's their little notepad.
Well, yeah, and even if, I mean, Wooly will have it up on the screen, right?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, you explain this is the system we're going to walk through. If you've got a day-long session, we'll usually spend a little while first doing some education on what an open system means.
And
help get their head around it.
if they want to invest $200, there are these big old things that they can keep forever. You get 2 of them, one for $100 each, and you just take it around and fill the boxes in, and then take a picture of it, dry erase it, and take it to the next department. They're really nice.
Yeah, they're just laminated.
Yeah,
You
they
just-
don't
you can
fold,
erase
but
them
they
out.
roll.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they're huge. They're
Yeah.
obnoxious.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, yeah, we'll give you, I'm really sorry, I misunderstood. We'll give you those, so you guys will have them.
But if you want to pay for them, we'll
Yeah, but when you're out professionally,
we're really good
we really
capitalists,
hope
just like
you
everybody else.
sign up for the big.
Other questions or comments? Again.
So I was just writing Dave, and I don't need to write him about that, because you're gonna, but in terms of the notes, the big sticky notes.
Oh, the big sticky notes, shoot. We have to order those.
He said Amazon 5x Post-its.
Yeah, we order them from
The
Amazon.
question is, will he provide them, or will he want you to get them, and that's the. I forgot what we did last year, Charlie. I don't remember how we did that, whether we had the teams do that or not.
I don't know, does RBL want to buy these guys some Amazon Post-its?
I'm putting that in an email today, right now,
I
and
mean,
we'll decide that.
I mean, we've actually had times where we use them and we don't too, depending on how much time we've got. Like if you're on a short window, I wouldn't use them, because you spend too much time playing with the notes. If you got a day session, use them. Right?
How about like a 4-hour session? Because we did it here in what was it, two and a half?
Yeah, you can do it with 4 hours.
Yeah, it was a little rushed, but 4 hours I think maybe would be.
Yeah.
It's really going to depend on how many of them you've got, the complexity of the system, and some of those kind of things. So, I mean, you take what you can get, and then the key for me is that you set it up so you can come back and do some follow-up one way or the other, so you can keep going. And again, if you do a nice job framing the setup, you can fill out parts of it by doing a number of different individual interviews and check-ins with that as well. Okay? I actually think, I mean, I've bought those Post-it notes at some of the big office supply stores too.
Oh, have you?
There's a few of them that actually stock them that are plenty big to.
N-
But they are the big
Staples
ones.
doesn't, but-
They're the big ones, yeah. So.
Yeah.
All right. Other questions or comments? Anything about the case? Anything about the model? Anything about life in general?
Oh, you know,
No.
you can just take a notepad and tape. You know, that used to work really well. Masking tape and a notepad.
Oh, you can do that. Yeah, you can use tape, yeah, yeah. It's just not as pretty a colors.
No.
Yeah, right, you get like the greens and the pinks.
Yeah,
You can
yeah,
find those in the
yeah.
notepad.
So, other questions or comments? Anything else I can do to be helpful for you? Any questions for me at all of work-related or otherwise? I'm happy to answer, or